Hi, this is Charlie with Only PVC Pyramids. This is part of our continuing series on the fundamentals of pyramid science. This is part 5 of that series. And the title of today's video is The End of the Aether. We're going to be talking today about why the ether has actually been taken out of the mainstream science agenda over the past 100 years. Even after Einstein, who originally thought that there wasn't a need for the ether, came back and restated almost 100 years ago that there was indeed a need for the ether for all of his equations to work properly. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. A few notes before we get started. Today I finally learned how to update my homepage on YouTube. So for those of you who've been watching these videos and are kind of confused because they were all in a mishmash, I've now got everything organized on the homepage, all the various series about pyramid research that we've been doing. So in addition to this series, you're going to find the extensive series, 20-part series on the summary of the Russian pyramid research, all nicely collated there. Also find some videos we've been doing recently on the LM4 experimental life energy meter, and also the videos that we've been doing recently on the Russian pyramid sacred geometry. Now, I haven't done one of those recently. I've been working very, very hard to get ready for the Conscious Life Expo, where I'm going to be giving this information for the first time. I've got a lot of new information. It'll be coming out here on the channel as soon as I've given that presentation later this month. But anyway, let's get started with today's video. As a way of background, I wanted to go over, because I haven't stated this before, what I feel are the 6 core elements to understanding pyramid science. And those are understanding the existence of the ether, understanding the existence of torsion waves and torsion fields, and then understanding the ability of the ether and torsion to organize and structure reality through sacred geometry. Now, we haven't talked about sacred geometry yet. We've talked about the other 2. And finally, we've got 3 other topics: the ability of objects, including pyramids, to act as passive torsion generators, the significance of phi spirals and phi scaling in the creative process, and the existence of a multi-dimensional universe. All of these are important topics. We've kind of covered the first 2, at least to some degree. The existence of the ether we've talked about through the research of John Keeley, Wilhelm Reich, and Victor Schauberger. And we've also discussed torsion waves through the research of Hal Puthoff, Harold Aspin, Bruce De Palma, and Nikolai Kozyrev. I've gotten comments that there are other people that I ought to be including in this discussion as well. And I will be, over time, trying to include others as well, but I'm trying to keep this relatively succinct in the beginning. I think we've gotten enough proof from these other videos of the existence of these 2 fields, and we'll be talking about sacred geometry soon. However, with that said, one of the things that people should be asking themselves right now is, well, if the ether and torsion fields are good, solid science, how come I didn't learn about them in school? And how come this information is apparently being suppressed? Well, that's the purpose of part of today's topic, and I wanted to go over that briefly with you today. This next page is coming directly from David Wilcock's Convergence series. It's online at divinecosmos.com. There is clear evidence that any scientific effort which moves towards a discovery of the importance of these geometries, and he's also talking here as well about the existence of the ether and torsion fields, this information is being actively suppressed, as those in the secret brotherhood still have a high degree of power and feel bound to ever conceal and never reveal the secrets of the order. Many of these group members have deliberately risen to power in various scientific institutions and are thus positioned to deflect certain types of research, especially those related to free energy and anti-gravity. Richard Hoagland and the Enterprise mission, working with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden, have shown how such suppression efforts trace back to the 19th century at least. So with that in mind, I wanted to bring in a new source of information today. There's an outstanding article which I have summarized for today's video, which is coming from the Resonance Science Foundation. This is the group that Nassim Haramein, my favorite quantum physicist in the world, founded in 2004. Now, this article is not by Nassim, but it's part of his staff, a gentleman named Adam Apollo, who wrote this article, again, entitled The End of the Ether. For thousands of years, the ether, a field which connects and permeates all things, was an essential facet of both the philosophy and science of reality in cultures around the world. Also known as quintessence, the ether is the fifth element in the series of classical elements thought to make up our experience of the universe. Greek stoichon, Japanese godai, Tibetan bon, European medieval alchemy, as well as Druidry, paganism, Wicca, Native American and tribal shamanism, and many other spiritual and philosophical lineages all describe the fundamental elements to be fire, air, earth, water, and ether. Although the ether goes by as many names as there are cultures that have referenced it, the general meaning always transcends and includes the same four material elements. It is sometimes more generally translated simply as spirit when referring to an incorporated living force behind all things. In Japanese, it is considered to be the void through which all other elements come into existence. In Hinduism, it is known as Akasha, which simply means space in Sanskrit. There are also many terms for the movement of energy through the ether or the movement of ether itself. These include qi, which is a traditional Chinese and Taoist concept for the natural energy or life force of any living thing. In Hinduism, a similar idea is known as prana, which is the life force which connects all the elements of the universe. For Hawaiian and some Polynesian cultures, this field of living force is known as mana. The same concept is known as Rua in Hebrew, as Lung in Tibetan Buddhism, and Pneuma in ancient Greece, and vital energy in Western philosophy. It's also popularized by the idea of the Force in the Star Wars series. The ether played a central role in our framework of understanding natural phenomena in the universe all the way up until the turn of the 20th century. Gravity was thought by both René Descartes and Isaac Newton to originate from the mechanics of the ether. During the time of Isaac Newton, this was a somewhat dangerous proposition, as postulation of such invisible forces working at a distance was considered to be an introduction of quote-unquote agencies into science. Yet even until the late 1800s, aluminiferous ether continued to be thought of as the medium through which electromagnetic waves travel. Proponents of both the particle and wave nature of light agreed that light must travel through some sort of medium. However, while the theories of the time required the ether in order to remain consistent, many experiments done to detect this medium failed. Its properties seemed to be too dynamic and ephemeral to test, and many of its qualities had already been explained by alternative theories. Several theories were produced to reconcile the observed properties of light with the movement of other objects that must be traveling through the ether, including the Earth. These ether drag theories were developed in consideration of whether the ether was completely stationary or moved uniformly, while objects moved through it, or if the ether was partially dragged along with massive objects like the Earth. In either case, both theories assume that movement of the ether should be detectable from the Earth's surface, since the Earth both spins and moves around the Sun. Many experiments were concocted to prove or refute the existence of the ether using these simple principles. One of the experiments done by Hippolyte Fizeau in 1851 measured the speed of light in water in order to detect if a moving medium or fluid would influence the movement of light traveling through it. Although the effect was much smaller than expected, the experiment showed that a moving medium could in fact adjust the speed of light, supporting the partial ether drag theory of Augustin Jean Fresnel. Although this was disturbing to most physicists at the time, it is important to note that Einstein expressed the importance of this experiment in his work on special relativity over a half-century later. The most famous of these experiments were performed by Albert Michelson and Edward Morley, and the final test is popularly known as the Michelson-Morley experiment. They set up an extremely sensitive interferometer to measure the etheric wind, or the presumably detectable movement of the ether as it passed through a spinning Earth traveling through space. Their experiments were designed to detect a change in the speed of light as low as 0.01%, mostly by viewing subtle changes in the interference patterns of light waves being split and recombined after traveling short distances. Their results, which showed a negligible change in the light interference, regardless of the time of day or the season, suggested that the ether must be dragged nearly completely by the Earth. However, this conflicted with the commonly observed properties of stellar aberration, as an ether being dragged along by the Earth would be expected to distort our view of the stars in various ways. Stellar aberration is an astronomical phenomenon which produces an apparent motion of celestial objects due to the change of the astronomer's inertial frame of reference. This conflict and the failure of so many other experiments attempting to verify the etheric wind resulted in continued rejection of the ether among the general scientific community of the time. When Einstein published his special theory of relativity, it solved many of the remaining theoretical problems that required an ether for explanation by replacing it with a conceptual framework for space-time itself. He suggested that there was a more simple way of looking at things which did not require a luminiferous ether, an idea which appealed greatly to the anti-ether movement popular in science in the early 1900s. The failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment also helped to accelerate the widespread acceptance of Einstein's proposed constancy for the speed of light, which, of course, now we know is no longer true. Following Einstein's publishing of general relativity in 1916, his layman's book on special and general relativity explained, according to this theory, there is no such thing as a special favored coordinate system to occasion the introduction of the ether idea, and hence there can be no ether drift nor any experiment with which to demonstrate it. Thus, for a coordinate system moving with the Earth to mirror the system of Michelson and Morley is not shortened, but it is shortened for a coordinate system which is at rest relatively to the Sun. That was a mouthful. This put the final nail in the coffin of the ether for the scientific community at large. Since that time, the ether has generally been considered for all practical purposes to be non-existent. Yet shortly after this information was published, one of Einstein's mentors, Hendrik Lorentz, wrote him a letter suggesting that general relativity reintroduced the ether rather than discarding it. While reintroducing the ether would have doomed any young emerging scientist at the time, Einstein by this time had already earned his fame through special relativity and mass energy equivalence, that famous equation E is equal to mc squared. He was still cautious at first, only offering a few public responses that brought up the subject, and his apparent contradictions did not make a new ether appealing to the scientific community. Einstein eventually published a complete explanation that would reconcile his apparently contradictory perspectives on the ether, first by asserting that special relativity does not explicitly negate the existence of an ether, suggesting only that it didn't explicitly need an ether to explain the relative properties of electromagnetism and movement. He then clarified and explained the essential importance of the ether to general relativity. To deny the ether, according to Einstein, is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. For the mechanical behavior of a corporeal system hovering freely in empty space depends not only on relative positions and relative velocities, but also on its state of rotation, which physically may be taken as a characteristic not appertaining to the system in and of itself. In order to be able to look upon the rotation of the system, at least formally, as something real, Newton objectivizes space. Since he classes his absolute space together with real things, for him rotation relative to an absolute space is also something real. Newton might no less well have called his absolute space ether, which is essential. What is essential is merely that besides observable objects, another thing which is not perceptible must be looked upon as real to enable acceleration or rotation to be looked upon as something real. This description and the rest of his paper, published in 1920, suggests that Einstein saw space-time itself as the new ether. However, this perspective was never popularized, and the ether was slowly forgotten as a metaphysical artifact of a previous scientific era. But to clarify Einstein's meaning even further, he is basically suggesting that if an object rotates, there must be a source for that rotation. If the source propelling an object to spin is not the object itself, then it must be the space around the object. So we can see here that although Einstein changed his views after hearing from his mentor and reconciled the fact himself once again to the fact that the ether had to exist, mainstream science, even though these words were coming from Einstein, refused to accept the ether. Now, we all know that the ether has come back into popular science, but not under the term ether. It's been known as zero-point field or the field and a lot of other terms. But the fact remains that the concepts that constitute the ether have been proven, and although mainstream science today still refuses to use the term of the ether has been proven countless times, and also by Einstein himself, to exist. So what we've seen here is another example of mainstream science controlled in many respects, at least according to Wilcock and Tom Bearden and Richard Hoagland, by powerful sources, has continued to prohibit knowledge of the ether to exist in mainstream science. I hope this has been helpful, and as always, please tell your friends about Only PVC Pyramids, this series, Fundamentals of Pyramid Science, and have them check out our YouTube page, Only PVC Pyramids, and our website, onlypvcpyramids.com. Thank you for listening, and you have a great day.